Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, July 2nd, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Israel orders new Khan Younis evacuation. So Israel has ordered Palestinians to evacuate from the eastern portion of Khan Younis, signaling its forces are preparing to re-invade the southern Gaza city, which has mostly been destroyed by the previous Israeli assault. So many of the over 1 million Palestinian civilians who fled the Israeli assault on Rafah have been sheltering in Khan Younis and are being forcibly displaced yet again. And I remember reading a lot of accounts from Palestinians who fled Rafah that, they've been displaced 5 or 6 times already since October. So this could be the 6th, 7th time for some of these Palestinians that they have to move again. And Khan Younis has been totally decimated. Many of them were still staying in tents. So Palestinians have been told to go to the nearby Al-Mawasi camp on the coast, which Israel has declared a safe zone. But this camp has come under attack. While I was gone, there was a major bombing at this camp that killed at least 25 Palestinians. There's been some other attacks, and this has happened. This is, following a pattern. Israel declares these areas safe and then bombs them anyway, or they bomb Palestinians as they're evacuating from areas. Just a nightmare for these Palestinians, for the Palestinian families. The picture I have in this story shows, women and children walking through the street in what looks like, either very early morning or the middle of the night because of this evacuation order. And you see these young kids. I mean, you just can't even imagine being in a situation like this where you've had to move your family so many times. It's, coming up on 9 months now of them having to live like this. So Israeli forces withdrew from Khan Younis in April. So only a few months ago did they leave the city, and they left it in complete ruins. Estimates are that more than 80% of the buildings in Khan Younis were destroyed by Israel, and many of the ones that weren't destroyed were left uninhabitable. So this really shows, this wasn't that long ago that the Israeli military left the city, and they said that they, destroyed Hamas in the city. Now they're ordering an evacuation, which means they're probably going back in. And it shows that Hamas is probably regrouped in the city. And as it has in other parts of Gaza that have been just completely decimated by the Israeli military. All of this destruction, all of this killing of civilians is not defeating Hamas. And Netanyahu is still insisting that his goal is to, eliminate or eradicate Hamas, however he puts it. Even when his own military is saying that that's not possible. This is something he said again on Sunday. He said that, he vowed again to continue this genocidal war until Hamas is eliminated. And he rejected the idea of a permanent ceasefire. Again, the Israeli military has said that they can't achieve this goal that Netanyahu is still pushing. So just an update on the numbers. Gaza's health ministry said on Monday that at least 37,900 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since October 7th, and that total includes around 15,000 children. The actual number of dead Palestinians is probably much higher, because their numbers don't take into account the Palestinians, the thousands under the rubble. And it's also just a matter of it being very difficult for them to count the dead since the communications have broken down and the destruction of all the healthcare facilities in Gaza. All right, so Khan Younis, something to keep an eye on there. The next one here, Blinken says that there's no sign Israel has lowered intensity in Gaza. This article is from Middle East Eye. So another thing that happened while I was gone is that Israel said that they were like scaling back operations in Gaza. But there's no sign that that's happened. And here is even, one of their biggest backers acknowledging that there is no sign that they have lowered the intensity. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Monday that there was no sign Israel had downgraded the intensity of its offensive on the Gaza Strip, despite Israeli statements that it was shifting to a lower intensity phase. He said, quote, "We've heard the Israelis talk about a significant downshift in their operations in Gaza. It remains to be seen," end quote. And he said this at an event hosted by the Brookings Institute think tank in Washington, D.C. For weeks, Israeli officials have signaled that they are downshifting their offensive on the Gaza Strip, even as its military continues to pummel the enclave, inflicting a staggering number of civilian deaths. On Saturday, at least 40 Palestinians were killed and 224 were wounded in 24 hours alone. So another thing that Blinken said in his little speech at the Brookings Institute was that, he blamed the lack of a ceasefire deal. He put all the blame on Hamas. He said the entire world agreed on this ceasefire deal. Israel agreed on this ceasefire deal. And the only issue was Hamas, which, they're just lying about this ceasefire thing when you had the prime minister of Israel come out and reject the deal right after Biden unveiled it, and just continuing to put all the blame on Hamas, even though you have Israeli media reporting, the real reason why Hamas came back seeking stronger guarantees for a permanent ceasefire, because Netanyahu was publicly saying over and over again that he wouldn't agree to that. But Blinken is still spinning this tale that it's all on Hamas. An interesting thing from the debate. So I didn't mention the presidential debate at all. There's plenty of commentary on that disaster. But I did watch it while I was in Australia, and there's very little talk of foreign policy. There was, but one thing that Trump did say that was very interesting was Biden said something like, Hamas is the only thing standing in the way of the ceasefire. And then Trump said, well, actually, Israel doesn't want to end it. They want to finish the job, essentially saying, I'm going to give them whatever they need to finish the job. And another thing is he called Biden a Palestinian. This is something Trump's been doing. He called Chuck Schumer a Palestinian not that long ago. He's essentially using it as a slur. And he says Biden's a bad Palestinian. It was just a complete joke, the whole debate. But especially the foreign policy stuff. I guess Biden's performance was the biggest joke of them all. But they barely touched on foreign policy, and when they did, those were the things that they said. But again, it was interesting that Trump said, no, actually, Israel doesn't want a ceasefire. All right, so the next one here, Doomsday weapons, Israeli warning amid regional escalation. So this article is from the Palestine Chronicle. An Israeli aviation industry official stated that Tel Aviv possesses the capability to break the equation by deploying what he termed doomsday weapons if faced with an existential threat in the region, Israeli media reported. So the Israeli newspaper Maariv quoted Yair Katz. He's the chairman of the Israel Aerospace Industry Workers Council, so kind of a defense industry guy, military, whatever you want to call it. But he said that resorting to breaking the equation would be an option if Iran, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and other Middle Eastern countries decide to confront Israel. He said, quote, "We have the ability to use a doomsday weapon," end quote. And of course, he's talking about Israel's nukes. They have a secret nuclear stockpile that the U.S. government does not officially recognize, that they keep quiet about. And this is something, I think a lot of people kind of forget, because, you see a lot of talk about if there is a big war, Iran and Hezbollah, they could smash Israel, but they do have nukes, and I don't put it past them using them. So it's just something that a lot of people seem to forget. And this is amid we have a few stories here about the situation in Lebanon amid this risk of a big regional escalation. So here we have, a reminder of the kind of weapons that Israel does have. All right, so the next one here, a report says that Israel will invade Lebanon later this month. So the German newspaper Bild reported on Monday that Israel is planning to invade Lebanon in the second half of July as Israeli forces and Hezbollah continue to trade fire across the border. The report, which cited diplomatic sources, said Israel would launch the assault unless Hezbollah stopped firing on northern Israel. That doesn't really track with what Israeli officials have been saying, because they're not saying that a ceasefire is enough. They're saying that they want to push Hezbollah back from the border, that they want them to withdraw to areas beyond the Litani River, which is about 18 miles north of the border. But this is what the report says. And Hezbollah's position is that it won't stop firing on northern Israel until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. And we've seen Israeli officials say that if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, they're going to escalate in Lebanon. So the U.S. claims that it is working hard to prevent an escalation in Lebanon, but it has conveyed that it would support Israel in the event of an invasion. A few things I went over yesterday, but the Israeli media, and this is something that's been clear now, could Israel's military handle really opening a second front in the north and continuing things in Gaza? People think no, and that's what Israeli media has been reporting as well, that the military is not really ready for this. So I think that's a sign that if they do this, they're really going to be looking for strong support from the U.S. To bail them out. So the next one here, the U.S. sends a ship to show support for Israel amid Lebanon tensions. So the U.S. has deployed an amphibious assault ship to the Middle East to demonstrate support for Israel amid soaring tensions on the Lebanon-Israel border. The Pentagon announced that the USS Wasp arrived in the eastern Mediterranean Sea last week. The deployment comes amid fears of a full-blown Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon as Israeli forces and Hezbollah continue to trade fire across the border. A U.S. official told the Associated Press that the deployment was about deterrence, but the U.S. show of force could embolden Israel. This is what kind of signal is this sending to Israel if that they're threatening war in Lebanon and the U.S. sends over the ship to, as a show of force. The U.S. insists that it is working to prevent a war in Lebanon. I said this in the last article, sorry, but it is important to understand that the U.S. is saying that they will still support Israel in the event that a full-scale war breaks out. So the Wasp is carrying a U.S. Marine Corps expeditionary unit and is sailing along with the USS Oak Hill, a dock landing ship. U.S. officials told NBC News last week that one purpose of this deployment is for the Wasp, the ship, to stand by to evacuate Americans in the event that a full-scale war breaks out along the Israel-Lebanon border. Another U.S. official told AP that the deployment of the Wasp was comparable to the U.S. sending warships to the region in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel and the start of the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. The U.S. said that the purpose of those ship deployments and building up its forces in the Middle East after October 7th was to prevent a regional war, but the assault on Gaza did spill out into the region anyway. Because, again, they're sending the signal to Israel that they have their back 100%, emboldening them to carry out this genocidal slaughter that we've seen in Gaza. And then, of course, that sparked all of the attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, which led to 3 U.S. troops being killed in Jordan. And then, of course, the Houthi attacks on commercial shipping that continue. The U.S. hasn't been able to stop that, even though they've been bombing Yemen, and just this whole disaster has broken out across the region. And Israel's escalations in Syria against Iran, and it's just been a complete mess. And they're saying, it's all for deterrence, but it doesn't seem to be deterring very much. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. military raises alert level at European bases. So the U.S. military has raised its alert level at bases in Europe amid soaring tensions with Russia that are the result of the U.S. increasing its support for Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory. U.S. and Western officials told the New York Times that the alert levels were raised in response to vague threats from Russian officials. Russia warned last week that it would retaliate against the U.S. in response to a Ukrainian attack on Crimea using a cluster bomb variant of the U.S.-provided ATACMS missiles that killed 5 civilians, including 2 children, on the beach near Sevastopol. So Russia said that it would respond to that there would be consequences, that there would be retaliation against the U.S. So it seems like the U.S. could be preparing for something at its bases in Europe. Russian President Vladimir Putin warned back in May that there would be major consequences for any NATO country that allows Ukraine to use its weapons to strike targets inside the Russian mainland. Putin made the warning before President Biden gave Ukraine the green light to use U.S.-provided missiles on targets across the border. So you had that warning. And U.S. military bases are currently at the alert level Charlie, which is the second highest level. U.S. officials said that there was no specific intelligence about a potential Russian attack on U.S. bases in Europe. They also accused Russian intelligence of being behind sabotage attacks in Europe, but they offered very little detail. There's no evidence that they put out to back up this claim. And some of the examples of sabotage attacks don't seem very, I don't know. One of them they said was a fire at an IKEA furniture store. Apparently that was Russian intelligence, according to these officials, that did that. So that, I don't know. Something doesn't sound right about that. There's talk about a lot of cyber attacks and things, but I don't know. U.S. bases in Europe support the proxy war in Ukraine by training Ukrainian troops, providing intelligence, and serving as hubs for weapons shipments. So basically, this sort of support, all of these escalations over the past 2 years, when it comes to U.S. involvement in the war, it's always risked, provoking a response from Russia. But lately we have seen, very serious escalations and very serious warnings from Russia. So, is something, are they preparing to do something? The U.S. says they don't have specific intelligence, but even just the fact that this is happening, that they're on high alert, it just goes to show what a disaster this whole proxy war is, and how insane it is that they're risking this type of stuff, that they're risking direct war with Russia. All right, so the next one here, Finnish parliament approves a new military deal with the U.S. So on Monday, Finland's parliament unanimously approved a new defense cooperation agreement with the U.S. that gives the U.S. military access to 15 bases in the Nordic nation, which shares an over 800-mile border with Russia. So one of these bases, one of the places where the U.S. can now position troops and equipment, is a border guard base, a Finnish border guard base on the border with Russia. It's not directly on the border. It's 20 miles away from the border. As far as I understand it, it's it's a very rural area. It's like dense forest that separates the base from the Russian border. But this, according to, I think it was The Economist that had a story on this, this is the closest base to the Russian border that the U.S. military now has access to. So Finland coming into NATO was a big deal because of this huge border. NATO has more than doubled its border with Russia. And now the U.S. is really going to build up its presence in Finland. Russia is building up its military presence near the Finland border. That border is being militarized. So just not good. The increase in tensions in that part of the world. And the U.S. signed a similar agreement with Sweden, which was ratified by the Swedish parliament last month. The deal gave the U.S. access to 17 bases in Sweden and allows the U.S. military to travel freely through the country. The Swedish agreement faced some opposition from Sweden's Green and Left parties, but it passed through parliament in a vote of 266 to 37, and 46 members of parliament did not vote. The main critique of the agreement was that they thought it left open the possibility of the U.S. stationing nuclear weapons in Sweden, as they do in under NATO's nuclear sharing program in Italy, Belgium, Turkey, the Netherlands, and Germany. So there's concern about that inside Sweden. And these are two, Sweden especially, historically neutral countries. But that has, changed over the years. And this is them joining NATO, really made it official and buried their policy of neutrality. All right. So the next one here, Ukraine recruits 3,000 soldiers from prisons. So Ukraine has released over 3,000 prisoners on parole and assigned them to military units after Zelensky signed a bill into law in May that allowed recruitment from Ukraine's prisons. Ukraine's Justice Ministry estimates that around 27,000 prisoners are eligible for military service under the new law, which allows the recruitment of murderers as long as they did not kill more than one person and only have no more than 3 years of their sentence to serve. So prisoners recruited by Russia's Wagner group made up much of the fighting force on the Russian side in the Battle of Bakhmut. Very brutal battle, the meat grinder. And at the time, Ukrainian and American officials were very critical of Russia using prisoners. And here we have Ukraine resorting to the same tactic. The new Ukrainian law is just one of the desperate measures being taken to deal with Ukraine's significant manpower shortages. They're also trying to pressure Ukrainian men living abroad to return home and fight. There is a new mobilization law and all of these things to get more bodies on the front lines. All right, so the next story here, Zelensky calls on the world to force Putin to make peace. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. In a series of posts on social media, President Volodymyr Zelensky demanded more weapons from his Western backers so Russia can be forced into a peace agreement. Advanced warplanes, long-range missiles, and air defenses were named on the Ukrainian leader's wish list. In an X post, Zelensky acknowledged that Ukraine was struggling to combat Russian glide bombs and said that Kiev needed a significant influx of arms. He said, quote, "Russian bombs remain Putin's key capability to wage war. The sooner the world helps us neutralize Russia's combat aviation, launching these bombs, and the sooner we can strike back with justified strikes. The world possesses enough strength to force Russia to make peace," end quote. So, of course, he's asking for more. He wants to be able to conduct long-range strikes inside Russia. So you had the U.S. give him the green light to use the missiles inside Russian territory over the border. Apparently, the U.S. is saying that they can't do long-range strikes like deep inside Russia. And that's another one of the things that Zelensky and his people are asking for. And they're also asking for a NATO no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. So more very dangerous escalations could be ahead. All right, so the last story here, former NSA chief revolves through OpenAI's door. So this article is from Responsible Statecraft from Stavrula Pabst. So this is interesting. Prominent artificial intelligence research organization OpenAI recently appointed newly retired U.S. Army General and former National Security Agency Director Paul M. Nikosin, I don't know how to pronounce his name, to its board of directors. Nikosin will join the board's newly announced Safety and Security Committee slated to advise OpenAI's board on critical safety and security-related matters and decisions. Established following an exodus of OpenAI higher-ups concerned about the company's perceived deprioritization of safety-related matters, the new Safety and Security Committee is OpenAI's apparent effort to reestablish a safety-forward reputation with an increasingly wary public. AI safety concerns are of the utmost importance, but OpenAI should not use them to ram through an appointment that appears poised to normalize AI's militarization while spinning the ever-revolving door between defense and intelligence agencies and big tech. So the revolving door, this is a term used for the military-industrial complex. You have generals retire. The one I always think of, because, it used to not be that, you have Lloyd Austin as the Secretary of Defense. He was on the board of Raytheon right before he, took charge of the Pentagon. So it's so blatant now that it used to not be at that level. I think it was Trump with Mattis that kind of set that precedent. Mattis worked for General Dynamics, I think, and then he became the Secretary of Defense, and then he resigned and went right back to his job at General Dynamics. I mean, you talk about a revolving door, the Secretary of Defense. So it's interesting to see an AI company, because AI is obviously is being militarized, and we see that in Gaza. OpenAI says that they're not going to be involved with that, but this is a sign that you appoint one of these, a U.S. Army general. That it is a lot like the companies like Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin that do this. So I just thought that was an interesting story. But that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints, one from Ted Galen Carpenter, the Republican establishment's sterile foreign policy perspective, one from Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies, confronting NATO's war summit, one from Chip Gibbons, Julian Assange is free, but justice has not been served, one from Dan McKnight, Joe Biden wants to steal your children, one from Jeffrey Sachs, save Ukraine from American meddling. So please go check all of that out. You could support us by sharing the show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like, subscribe, all that stuff. I appreciate everyone wishing me well upon my return from vacation. Was a very good vacation. So yeah, that's it for me for today. I will talk to you tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.